I watched his lawyer smirk as he called my arguments cute, dismissing me as just another desperate housewife playing pretend in a mediation room. Mrs. Matthews, he chuckled, perhaps you should reconsider representing yourself. This is quite above your pay grade. Then I slid my bar card and Harvard JD certificate across the mahogany table. His laughter died so abruptly you could hear the air conditioning humming. When he stammered about requesting a recess, I smiled and said simply, I decline. I'm ready for judgment. What happened next changed everything. Before we continue, I want to take a moment to thank you for joining me on this journey of underestimation and vindication. If you've ever been dismissed because of someone's assumptions about who you are, this story might resonate deeply with you. Consider subscribing. It's completely free and connects you with others who appreciate these tales of quiet strength and calculated justice. Now, let's return to the moment everything changed. I never planned to be sitting in a sterile conference room at Henderson Walsh & Associates at 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon, facing down my husband's high-powered attorney while representing myself in our divorce mediation. But life has a way of forcing your hand when you least expect it. The morning had started like any other in the past month since David moved out. I'd made coffee for one, checked my emails from the nonprofit literacy organization where I volunteered 3 days a week, and tried to ignore the empty spaces in our Malibu home where his belongings used to be. 22 years of marriage don't just disappear overnight, but David seemed determined to erase them as efficiently as possible. Looking back now, I can see the signs I missed, or rather, the signs I chose not to see because acknowledging them would have meant admitting that the life I'd built was constructed on quicksand. The late nights that became later, the business trips that grew more frequent and mysterious, the way David had started looking at me like I was furniture he'd grown tired of, functional but no longer aesthetically pleasing. The transformation had been so gradual that I'd barely noticed it happening. When we first married, David would ask my opinion on everything: business decisions, investment opportunities, even the color of his ties. Somewhere along the way, those consultations had stopped. I'd gone from being his partner to being his dependent, from his equal to his accessory. But I suppose that had been the plan all along. The call came at 10 a.m. sharp, jarring me from my morning routine of pretending everything was normal. David's attorney, Harrison Walsh III, his voice dripping with barely concealed condescension even through the phone. Mrs. Matthews, I'm calling to inform you that we're prepared to offer a very generous settlement. Considering your circumstances, I believe you'll find our terms more than fair. Circumstances. The word hung in the air like a challenge. In David's narrative, shared through his lawyer's careful phrasing, I was the stay-at-home wife who'd never worked a real job, the woman who'd spent her days shopping, lunching with friends, and managing household staff, a kept woman with no understanding of the business world or legal complexities. If only they knew how wrong they were. I'd like to review the terms in person, I said calmly, already reaching for my appointment book. Of course, though I should mention, Mrs. Matthews, that my client is being extraordinarily generous given the prenuptial agreement you signed. You might want to consider hiring representation. These matters can be quite complex for someone without legal training. Legal training? The irony was so thick, I almost laughed. Instead, I maintained my composure, letting Walsh assume he was dealing with exactly the kind of woman David had trained me to appear to be. I'll be there at 2:30, I replied, ending the call before he could offer more unsolicited advice about my supposed inadequacies. That gave me 4.5 hours to prepare, 4.5 hours to become someone Harrison Walsh III had never met, though she'd been hiding in plain sight for over 20 years. I walked to my home office, a room David had always called my hobby space, with that particular tone that suggested my activities there were charming but ultimately meaningless. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with first-edition classics, contemporary fiction, and behind them, hidden like a secret life, my legal texts: constitutional law, contract law, family law, criminal procedure. Books I'd accumulated over the years, ostensibly for my volunteer work with legal aid clients, but really because the law had never stopped calling to me. The office was my sanctuary, the one place in our house where David never ventured. He dismissed it as my little reading nook, never bothering to examine the titles on my shelves or ask about the cases I reviewed late into the night. If he had, he might have discovered that his docile wife was far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. From the locked filing cabinet behind my desk, I withdrew a manila folder I hadn't opened in years. Inside, still crisp despite being over 2 decades old, was my bar admission certificate for the state of California. Ella Catherine Morrison, admitted to practice law, June 15, 2001. Below it, equally preserved, my Harvard Law School diploma, Juris Doctor, graduated magna cum laude. The woman who earned these credentials had vanished the day I met David Matthews at a charity gala in Beverly Hills. She'd been 26, ambitious, and 3 months into her career at a prestigious downtown firm. I'd been working 18-hour days, living on coffee and ambition, building a reputation as a fierce advocate for clients who'd been written off by the system. David had been 35, devastatingly handsome, and building a tech empire that would eventually make him worth 9 figures. He'd approached me at the bar, confident and charming, with eyes that seemed to see right through me. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," he'd said, and he'd been right. I'd only attended the gala because my firm required all associates to participate in business development activities. "I would," I'd admitted. "I have a brief due tomorrow morning." "What kind of law?" "Family law, divorce case. My client's husband has been hiding assets in offshore accounts, and I'm trying to trace the money trail." David had looked genuinely interested, asking intelligent questions about asset recovery and forensic accounting. It wasn't until months later that I realized he'd been taking notes for his own future reference. When he proposed after a whirlwind 8-month courtship, he'd made it clear he wanted a wife who could focus entirely on building their life together. "You're too brilliant to waste your talents on other people's problems," he'd said, taking my hands in his as we stood on the balcony of his penthouse. "I want you to help me build something extraordinary. Be my partner in everything that matters." At the time, it felt like choosing love over career. Now, I understood, it had been about control. David had wanted a wife who depended entirely on him, who could never challenge his decisions or threaten his position as the sole provider. A woman who would be grateful for whatever scraps he offered in a divorce. The seduction had been masterful. Instead of forbidding me from practicing law, he'd made it seem like a romantic sacrifice. Instead of isolating me from my colleagues, he'd gradually introduced me to a social circle where career women were viewed with subtle disdain. Instead of preventing me from staying current with legal developments, he'd encouraged my volunteer work, treating it like a harmless hobby that kept me busy while he built his empire. I'd let my bar membership lapse after 5 years of non-practice, but I'd renewed it quietly 3 years ago when I started doing more substantial work with the legal aid clinic. David had never noticed the continuing education credits I earned, the late nights I spent reviewing case law, or the pro bono clients I'd helped navigate family court. In his mind, I was still the woman who'd given up her career for love. He was about to learn how spectacularly wrong he'd been. I dressed carefully for the meeting, selecting each piece like armor. Not the designer clothes David expected, but a sharp black suit I'd purchased for court appearances during my brief stint in practice. The jacket fit perfectly, tailored to project authority without aggression, conservative but commanding. My hair pulled back in a neat chignon, minimal jewelry except for my wedding ring, which I'd continue wearing until the divorce was final. Let them think I was clinging to false hope. In my briefcase, I packed the documents that would destroy their assumptions. Bank records going back 24 years. Business filings David thought I'd never seen. Email exchanges he'd forgotten about. Phone records that told a very different story about his business trips. And most importantly, the recordings he'd made himself, stored in our shared cloud account that he'd never bothered to change the password for. David had always been meticulous about documentation, a habit that served him well in business but would prove devastating in divorce court. He'd recorded our conversations about the prenup, thinking he was protecting himself from future claims that he'd coerced me. He'd saved emails about his asset protection strategies, believing they demonstrated prudent financial planning. He kept detailed records of his extramarital activities, apparently viewing them as business expenses. The man who'd built his fortune on being smarter than everyone else had created a paper trail of his own deception. Henderson, Walsh, and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming Century Tower. I'd researched Harrison Walsh III extensively over the past month, using databases I'd maintained access to through my legal aid work. Third-generation lawyer, Harvard undergraduate, but Yale Law, reputation for aggressive tactics in high-asset divorces. His cases rarely went to trial because he was known for intimidating opposing counsel and their clients into unfavorable settlements. His track record was impressive, a 15-year streak of settlements that favored his clients by margins that suggested either exceptional skill or systematic intimidation of unrepresented spouses. His client list read like a who's who of Los Angeles business elite, men who wanted their divorces handled quietly and decisively. His hourly rate was astronomical, his retainer legendary, and his reputation for crushing opposition was well established. What Walsh didn't know was that I'd been following his career since my days in practice. I'd studied his tactics, analyzed his settlements, and identified the patterns in his approach. While he'd been building his reputation on the assumption that most opposing parties were either unrepresented or poorly represented, I'd been taking notes. The receptionist, blonde and perfectly polished, gave me a look that managed to be both sympathetic and condescending. "Mrs. Matthews, Mr. Walsh is ready for you. Can I get you some water, tea? This must be so overwhelming." The performance was flawless. The concerned smile, the gentle tone, the implicit assumption that I was a victim in need of comfort. I'd seen the same act countless times when I'd represented clients in similar situations. It was designed to reinforce the power dynamic, to remind me that I was the suppliant in this exchange. "Coffee, black," I replied, "and I'm fine, thank you." She led me down a hallway lined with awards and photographs of Walsh with various celebrities and politicians. Power and intimidation, carefully curated. Each frame told the same story. Harrison Walsh III was a man who moved in influential circles, who commanded respect from the wealthy and powerful. The message was clear: you don't want to make an enemy of someone like this. At the end of the hall, she knocked on a door marked Conference Room A and ushered me inside with the same solicitous manner she'd probably used for hundreds of soon-to-be divorced wives over the years. The room was designed to impress and intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, offering a view that stretched from the Pacific to the mountains. The conference table could seat 20, its surface polished to mirror brightness. The walls were lined with legal texts and framed diplomas, a testament to the intellectual firepower that opposing parties would face in this room. Harrison Walsh III sat at the head of the table like a king holding court. He was a man in his early 50s with silver hair and the kind of tan that came from weekend sailing in Newport Beach. His suit probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, perfectly tailored to project success and authority. His watch was a Rolex, his cufflinks gold, his wedding ring a thick band that suggested stability and traditional values. Everything about him screamed establishment power, old money confidence, the kind of man who'd never doubted his place in the world or his right to occupy it. Beside him sat David, looking uncomfortable in a way I'd never seen before. We'd been married for 22 years, and I'd watched him command boardrooms, negotiate multi-million-dollar deals, and fire executives without flinching. Today, he couldn't quite meet my eyes. This was the first time I'd seen him since he'd moved out, and I was struck by how much he'd changed. He'd lost weight, gotten a new haircut, and was wearing clothes I'd never seen before. The transformation was jarring. He looked like a man who'd shed an old skin and was still adjusting to the new one. "Mrs. Matthews," Walsh stood, extending his hand with practiced charm. "Harrison Walsh, I'm so sorry we're meeting under these circumstances." I shook his hand firmly, noting his surprise at my grip. Most of the women who sat in this chair probably offered limp handshakes, their confidence already shattered by the prospect of divorce proceedings. Walsh wasn't expecting resistance. "Mr. Walsh, thank you for accommodating my schedule. Please, sit wherever you're comfortable. Can I ask where your attorney is? I was expecting to meet with your representation." The question was designed to establish dominance from the first moment. By representing herself, I was immediately positioned as the amateur facing the professional, the David confronting Goliath. In Walsh's experience, unrepresented parties were either desperate or delusional, and either condition made them easier to manipulate. "I'm representing myself," I said, taking the seat directly across from him, not at the side of the table where suppliants typically sat, but in a position of equality. The choice was deliberate, and I saw Walsh notice it. Walsh exchanged a glance with David, and I caught the slight smile that played at the corners of his mouth. The look said everything. This is going to be easier than we thought. "Mrs. Matthews, I have to advise you that this is highly irregular. Divorce proceedings, especially those involving significant assets, require specialized knowledge. I'd strongly recommend—" "I understand your concern," I interrupted smoothly, "but I'm comfortable proceeding." The interruption was calculated. In my years of practice, I'd learned that establishing conversational control early in a negotiation was crucial. By cutting off Walsh's prepared speech, I was signaling that I wouldn't be following his script. "Very well." He opened a thick folder and withdrew a document. "Let's begin with our settlement offer. As you'll see, my client is being extraordinarily generous." He slid the papers across the table with the confidence of a man who'd done this hundreds of times. The gesture was theatrical, designed to emphasize the power imbalance. He was offering charity. I was expected to be grateful. I picked up the document and began reading, my expression carefully neutral despite what I was seeing. Years of poker games with David's business associates had taught me to control my reactions, a skill that was serving me well now. The settlement proposal was even more insulting than I'd anticipated. David was offering me the Malibu house, which I knew was mortgaged to the hilt, $50,000 in cash, and $3,000 monthly alimony for 5 years. In exchange, I would waive all claims to his business interests, stock options, retirement accounts, and the various properties he'd acquired during our marriage. According to my own calculations, based on financial records David thought I'd never seen, I was being offered roughly 3% of our marital assets. It was a settlement designed not just to favor David, but to humiliate me in the process. "This is quite generous," Walsh continued, his voice warm with false sincerity, "especially considering the prenuptial agreement clearly states that in the event of divorce, you're entitled to significantly less." I continued reading, taking my time. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, a negotiating tactic I'd learned from watching David in business meetings. When people feel compelled to fill silence, they often reveal more than they intend. When I finally looked up, both men were watching me with expressions of barely contained impatience. David was drumming his fingers on the table, a nervous habit I recognized. Walsh maintained his professional demeanor, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. He was already planning his next move, confident that I would either accept the offer or make easily dismissed counterdemands. "Mr. Walsh," I said, setting the document down carefully, "I'm curious about something. You mentioned the prenuptial agreement multiple times. Do you have a copy here?" "Of course." He produced another document, this one much shorter. As you can see, it's quite clear. I accepted the prenup and read through it slowly, every word carefully considered. It was indeed the document I'd signed 22 years ago, but I remembered the circumstances of that signing very differently than David had apparently described them to his attorney. The prenup was a masterpiece of one-sided legal drafting. In the event of divorce, I would be entitled to whatever separate property I'd brought to the marriage, which was minimal, plus a modest alimony payment that decreased over time. All business assets, real estate acquisitions, and investment gains would remain David's separate property. Even the house we'd lived in would revert to him since it had been purchased in his name alone. At the time I'd signed it, David had assured me it was just a formality, something his lawyers insisted on but that we'd never need to worry about. "We're going to be together forever," he'd said. "This is just paperwork." Now I could see it for what it really was, a financial prison designed to ensure I could never leave him without losing everything. "This is interesting," I said, looking up at Walsh. "You're basing your entire settlement offer on this prenuptial agreement?" "Among other factors, yes. It clearly limits your claim to marital assets." I pretended to study the document again, though I'd memorized every clause years ago when I'd first begun to suspect David's true intentions. When I finally looked up, both men were watching me with expressions of barely contained impatience. David was drumming his fingers on the table, a nervous habit I recognized. Walsh maintained his professional demeanor, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. He was already planning his next move, confident that I would either accept the offer or make easily dismissed counterdemands. "Mr. Walsh," I said, setting the document down carefully, "I'm curious about something. You mentioned the prenuptial agreement multiple times. Do you have a copy here?" Of course. He produced another document, this one much shorter. As you can see, it's quite clear. I accepted the prenup and read through it slowly, every word carefully considered. It was indeed the document I'd signed 22 years ago, but I remembered the circumstances of that signing very differently than David had apparently described them to his attorney. The prenup was a masterpiece of one-sided legal drafting. In the event of divorce, I would be entitled to whatever separate property I'd brought to the marriage, which was minimal, plus a modest alimony payment that decreased over time. All business assets, real estate acquisitions, and investment gains would remain David's separate property. Even the house we'd lived in would revert to him since it had been purchased in his name alone. At the time I'd signed it, David had assured me it was just a formality, something his lawyers insisted on but that we'd never need to worry about. "We're going to be together forever," he'd said. "This is just paperwork." Now I could see it for what it really was, a financial prison designed to ensure I could never leave him without losing everything. "This is interesting," I said, looking up at Walsh. "You're basing your entire settlement offer on this prenuptial agreement?" "Among other factors, yes. It clearly limits your claim to marital assets." I pretended to study the document again, though I'd memorized every clause years ago when I'd first begun to suspect David's true intentions. "And you've had this reviewed by someone familiar with California family law?" Walsh's expression sharpened slightly. The question implied doubt about his competence, a subtle challenge to his authority. "Mrs. Matthews, I've been practicing family law for over 25 years. I'm quite familiar with the relevant statutes." "Of course, I didn't mean to question your expertise." I smiled apologetically, the same smile I'd perfected over years of charity luncheons and corporate dinners. David shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Ella, maybe we should discuss this privately. Harrison's put together a fair package. You could be set for life." Set for life, on $50,000 and a mortgaged house. The condescension was so thick I could practically taste it. This was David at his worst, the patronizing tone he used when he thought he was being generous to someone who didn't deserve his largesse. "I appreciate the offer," I said, still maintaining my pleasant demeanor, "but I have a few concerns about the legal foundation." Walsh leaned back in his chair, a predator sensing easy prey. This was familiar territory for him, the desperate spouse grasping at straws, making arguments that could be easily dismissed. Such as, "Well, for starters, this prenuptial agreement was signed under what I believe would be considered duress. David presented it to me exactly 72 hours before our wedding, after all the invitations had been sent, deposits paid, and guests had made travel arrangements. I was given no opportunity to seek independent counsel, and I was explicitly told that the wedding would be canceled if I didn't sign immediately." The change in atmosphere was immediate. Walsh straightened in his chair, his casual confidence replaced by sharp attention. David's face had gone pale. "That's not," David started. "According to California Family Code Section 1615, I continued, my voice remaining conversational despite the legal precision of my words, A prenuptial agreement is not enforceable if the party against whom enforcement is sought proves that she did not execute the agreement voluntarily. The circumstances I just described would certainly qualify as involuntary. Walsh was no longer smiling. The citation was specific, accurate, and devastating to their case. Either I'd done extensive research or I knew more about family law than I was letting on. Mrs. Matthews, are you saying you have evidence of these circumstances? I do, actually. I reached into my briefcase and withdrew a small recording device. David insisted on recording our conversation about the prenup. He said he wanted to be sure there were no misunderstandings later. I believe his exact words were, "Sign this or there's no wedding, your choice." The color drained from David's face completely. He'd forgotten about that recording, made on his own phone and later transferred to our shared cloud storage. At the time, he'd thought he was creating evidence of my voluntary agreement. Instead, he'd documented his own coercion. Even if we set aside the prenup, Walsh said, recovering quickly but with notably less confidence, you're still not entitled to half of everything. California is a community property state, but business assets acquired through individual effort and skill are often classified as separate property. That's partially correct, I agreed, as if we were having an academic discussion rather than a negotiation worth millions of dollars. However, Matthews Tech Solutions was founded using $200,000 from our joint savings account, money that came from the sale of my condo. The business was built using community property funds, making it community property regardless of who provided the sweat equity. Walsh was no longer leaning back casually. He was taking notes now, his pen moving rapidly across his legal pad. Do you have documentation of this initial funding? Bank records, sale documents, and David's own business plan, which explicitly acknowledges the use of marital funds for startup capital. I withdrew another folder from my briefcase, thick with meticulously organized documents. I also have records showing that during the first 3 years of the business, I provided significant unpaid consulting services, market research, client development, administrative support. Under California law, this creates an additional claim to business assets beyond the initial community property investment. David was staring at me as if I'd sprouted a second head. Ella, where is all this coming from? You never showed any interest in the legal aspects of the business. The question revealed everything about how little he actually knew me. I'd shown interest in everything about our life together, but he'd stopped listening years ago. When I'd asked about the business, he'd dismissed my questions. When I'd offered suggestions, he'd patted my head and told me not to worry about such complicated matters. When I'd tried to understand our financial situation, he'd assured me that he was handling everything. I showed interest in everything about our life together, David. You just stopped listening. The words hung in the air, carrying 22 years of dismissed contributions and ignored insights. Walsh cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the personal tension, but recognizing that his case was rapidly deteriorating. Mrs. Matthews, these are interesting points, but I'm not sure they significantly change the overall picture. The majority of the business growth occurred through my clients' individual efforts over the past 20 years. Which brings us to the most interesting part, I said, producing yet another document from my seemingly bottomless briefcase. This is a forensic accounting report I commissioned last month. It shows that over the past decade, David has been systematically transferring company assets to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Approximately $12 million in what should be community property has been hidden from marital assets. The silence that followed was deafening. Walsh had gone completely still, his pen frozen over his notepad. David looked like he might be sick. The forensic accounting report was a masterpiece of financial detective work, compiled by a firm that specialized in tracing hidden assets in high-net-worth divorces. It detailed a complex web of shell companies, offshore trusts, and international transfers designed to hide community property from divorce proceedings. That's not possible, David stammered. Those are legitimate business expenses, international expansion funds. For a company that has no international operations, I interrupted smoothly, I also have communications between David and his financial advisor discussing the best ways to protect assets from potential divorce proceedings. These conversations began 3 years ago, well before David filed for divorce. Walsh was studying me with new eyes, seeing me clearly for the first time. Mrs. Matthews, where exactly did you obtain this forensic accounting report? I hired Morrison & Associates, a firm that specializes in high-asset divorce cases. I let that sink in for a moment, watching their faces as they processed the implications. They're very thorough. Morrison & Associates, Walsh repeated slowly, the name clearly familiar to him. The Morrison who founded that firm, any relation? My maiden name is Morrison. Eleanor Morrison founded the firm. She's my sister. David's mouth fell open. Your sister? Ella, you told me your sister worked in real estate. Eleanor does work in real estate. High-end divorce settlements often involve significant real estate holdings. She specializes in complex asset division cases. I smiled, enjoying the look of dawning comprehension on both their faces. She's also one of the most successful family law attorneys in California. The revelation about Eleanor transformed the entire dynamic of the room. Walsh knew her reputation. She was legendary in Los Angeles legal circles for her aggressive representation of wives in high-asset divorces. Her firm had recovered hundreds of millions in hidden assets over the years, and she was known for her meticulous preparation and ruthless courtroom tactics. If Eleanor Morrison was involved in this case, even peripherally, it meant that every move David had made was probably documented, analyzed, and prepared for strategic use. It meant that the woman sitting across from Walsh wasn't the helpless housewife he'd assumed her to be, but someone with access to resources and expertise that could destroy his client. Walsh was frantically making notes now, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. Mrs. Matthews, I think we may have underestimated the complexity of this situation. Perhaps we should schedule another meeting after I've had a chance to review. Actually, Mr. Walsh, I think we're just getting started. I opened my briefcase one final time and withdrew a leather portfolio. I have a counter-proposal. I slid the document across the table with the same casual confidence Walsh had shown earlier. The gesture was deliberate, a reversal of power that made clear who was now controlling the negotiation. Walsh began reading, his expression growing increasingly grim with each page. The counterproposal was comprehensive, detailed, and devastating. It wasn't just a settlement demand, it was a complete financial autopsy of David's deceptions. This is quite comprehensive, he said finally, his voice notably subdued. I'm seeking 50% of all marital assets, including business interests, based on community property law. An additional 15% penalty for asset concealment, as allowed under California Family Code Section 2106. Full reimbursement for my forensic accounting costs, attorney's fees, and punitive damages for financial elder abuse. Attorney's fees? Walsh looked up sharply. But you're representing yourself. I am, but I'm also billing my time at my standard hourly rate of $650 per hour. I've logged approximately 80 hours of work on this case so far. Walsh stared at me, and I could see the exact moment when he realized he'd been played. Your standard hourly rate? I reached into my briefcase one more time and withdrew 2 items, my California State Bar card and my Harvard Law School diploma. I slid them across the table with the same casual confidence Walsh had shown when he'd first presented his insulting settlement offer. I'm sorry, I should have introduced myself properly. I'm Ella Catherine Morrison Matthews, Juris Doctor, Harvard Law School, magna cum laude. I'm licensed to practice law in the state of California, and I specialize in complex family law matters. The transformation in Walsh's demeanor was complete. The confident attorney who'd patronized me moments earlier had been replaced by a man who was rapidly calculating the extent of his miscalculation. He was facing an opponent who not only understood the law as well as he did, but who had spent months preparing for this exact confrontation. David was staring at me like I was a complete stranger, which in many ways I supposed I was. Ella, I don't understand. You never said, you never mentioned. You never asked. In 22 years of marriage, you never once asked about my education, my career before we met, or what I did during the day while you were at work. You assumed I was the helpless housewife you wanted me to be. The accusation hung in the air, carrying decades of dismissal and assumption. David had constructed an entire narrative about who I was based on what he wanted me to be, never bothering to discover who I actually was. When we met, I was 3 months into my career at Morrison, Hayes & Associates. I had clients, cases, a future I was building. But you made it clear that being your wife was incompatible with being a practicing attorney. So I made a choice. I thought I was choosing love over career. Now I understand I was choosing dependence over independence. Walsh had recovered enough to speak, though his voice lacked its earlier authority. Mrs. Matthews, Miss Morrison, I think we need to request a recess. This changes the entire dynamic of our negotiations. No, I said firmly, I decline your request for a recess. We're going to finish this today. But I need time to consult with my client to review these new developments. Mr. Walsh, you've had 22 years to review the developments in my marriage. I've had 1 month to untangle the web of deception and asset hiding that your client has constructed. I think that's sufficient time for both of us to understand where we stand. I opened my portfolio to a fresh page of notes, every movement deliberate and professional. The scattered housewife of Walsh's imagination had been replaced by the formidable attorney I'd always been underneath. Now, let's discuss the terms of my counterproposal. As I mentioned, I'm seeking 50% of all marital assets. Based on the forensic accounting report, that amounts to approximately $47 million. David choked on his coffee. $47 million? Ella, that's impossible. The company isn't worth that much. According to your own financial statements filed with the SEC for your IPO preparation, Matthews Tech Solutions is valued at $78 million. That doesn't include your personal real estate holdings, investment accounts, retirement funds, or the $12 million you've hidden offshore. I produced another document from my portfolio, David's own SEC filings, which he'd apparently assumed I would never see or understand. These are public records, David. Anyone can access them. The fact that you never thought I would tells me everything about what you think of my intelligence. Walsh was scribbling notes frantically, trying to keep up with revelations that were destroying his case by the minute. Mrs. Matthews, even if we accept your valuation, the court might not award such a significant percentage. Actually, Mr. Walsh, under California law, I'm entitled to 50% as a starting point. The additional 15% I'm seeking is specifically allowed as a penalty for asset concealment. Your client has been systematically hiding community property for 3 years. That's not just grounds for an unequal division of assets, it's potentially criminal fraud. The word criminal hung in the air like a threat. David's face had gone white, and Walsh was frantically flipping through his legal pad, trying to find some angle he hadn't considered. Furthermore, I continued, my voice maintaining its professional calm, I have evidence that David has been planning this divorce for years, while simultaneously encouraging me to remain financially dependent on him. He's been paying for financial advice on asset protection while telling me we were saving for retirement. He's been transferring funds to hidden accounts while asking me to cut back on household expenses. This isn't just asset concealment, it's financial elder abuse. Elder abuse? Walsh looked genuinely confused. I'm 57 years old, Mr. Walsh. Under California law, financial exploitation of someone over 55 constitutes elder abuse, which carries additional penalties, including treble damages and mandatory attorney's fees. The citation was accurate, and Walsh knew it. Elder abuse laws had been strengthened in recent years, and the financial exploitation provisions were particularly robust. If I could prove systematic financial abuse, which the evidence clearly supported, David could face not just civil penalties, but potential criminal charges. Walsh set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, a man who had just realized he was outgunned. For the first time since I'd entered the room, he looked genuinely concerned about his position. Mrs. Matthews, I think my client may have misrepresented certain aspects of your marriage and your capabilities. I need to have a private conversation with him before we proceed. By all means, I said graciously. I'll wait in the lobby. I gathered my documents and left the room, closing the door behind me. Through the glass walls, I could see Walsh leaning toward David, their conversation intense and clearly uncomfortable. David kept shaking his head, his hands moving in animated gestures I recognized as his tell when he was lying or trying to justify the unjustifiable. In the lobby, I sat calmly, reviewing my notes and preparing for the next phase of the negotiation. Other attorneys passed by, some nodding politely, others stopping to chat with the receptionist. I recognized several faces from my days in practice, colleagues who might remember me if they looked closely enough. One of them did. Patricia Chen, a family law attorney I'd worked with on several cases years ago, stopped dead when she saw me. Ella Morrison? Is that really you? Patricia, I smiled, rising to embrace my former colleague. It's been far too long. Patricia Chen had been one of the sharpest family law attorneys in Los Angeles when I'd left practice. Seeing her now, impeccably dressed and clearly successful, reminded me of the professional world I'd abandoned for what I'd thought was love. I heard you'd gotten married and left practice, she said, studying my face with the intensity that had made her so effective in depositions. But I never imagined. Are you here on a case? My own case, actually. I gestured toward the conference room where heated voices were becoming audible even through the supposedly soundproof glass. Divorce proceedings. Patricia's expression shifted immediately. She understood the implications. A skilled attorney representing herself in her own divorce was either supremely confident or facing circumstances that made trust impossible. Against Harrison Walsh? She glanced toward the conference room where Walsh and David were clearly in heated discussion. That's bold. He's got quite the reputation. So I've heard. But reputations are built on assumptions, and assumptions can be dangerous. She smiled, and I saw a flash of the woman who'd once eviscerated an opposing counsel for underestimating her client's business acumen. I always wondered what happened to you, Ella. You were brilliant, one of the most naturally gifted attorneys I'd ever worked with. When you disappeared from practice, the rumor was that you'd married money and retired to a life of leisure. The irony was bitter. I had married money, but leisure had never been part of the equation. Instead, I'd spent 22 years in a different kind of prison, one constructed of assumptions and expectations rather than bars and walls. Turns out the rumors were only half right, I said, but I never stopped practicing law. I just practiced it quietly. Through the glass, I could see Walsh standing now, his hands gesticulating as he spoke to David. David's posture was defensive, his arms crossed, his face flushed with what I recognized as frustrated anger. They were clearly arguing about strategy, about how to handle revelations that had fundamentally altered their position. Patricia, I should get back, but it was wonderful seeing you. Ella, she paused, then spoke carefully. If you need anything, a second opinion, moral support, or just someone to talk through strategy, you have my number. The offer was generous, especially given that we hadn't spoken in over 20 years. But it reminded me of something I'd forgotten during my years of isolation. The legal community, for all its competitive nature, was also remarkably supportive of its own, especially when one of its own was fighting for justice. Thank you. That means more than you know. As I walked back toward the conference room, I felt a strength I hadn't experienced in decades. For too long, I'd been fighting this battle alone, but seeing Patricia reminded me that I wasn't just Ella Matthews, the abandoned housewife. I was Eleanor Morrison, the attorney who'd once been considered one of the rising stars of Los Angeles family law. It was time to remind everyone else of that fact. When I knocked and re-entered the conference room, the atmosphere had changed completely. Walsh looked haggard, as if he'd aged years in the 20 minutes I'd been gone. David wouldn't meet my eyes, staring instead at his hands folded on the table. Gentlemen, I said, taking my seat with renewed confidence, have you had sufficient time to discuss the situation? Walsh cleared his throat, his earlier arrogance replaced by careful professionalism. Mrs. Matthews, Ms. Morrison, my client has provided some additional context about your marriage and your background. I believe we may have approached this negotiation from an incorrect premise. Which premise was that? The assumption that you were unfamiliar with legal proceedings and financial complexities. Walsh's admission was clearly painful for him. A man who'd built his reputation on intimidating unrepresented spouses was now facing the reality that he'd miscalculated spectacularly. I see. And how does this change your position? David finally looked up, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Genuine fear. Not the momentary anxiety he felt during business negotiations, but the deep existential fear of someone who realized they'd underestimated their opponent in a fight that could cost them everything. "Ella," he said, his voice softer than it had been all afternoon, "I think we need to talk, privately." "I'm comfortable continuing with Mr. Walsh present," I replied evenly. "After all, you've been discussing our private business with him for weeks. I see no reason to exclude him now." Walsh shifted uncomfortably. Being present for this conversation meant witnessing the complete breakdown of his case, but leaving would mean abandoning his client at a crucial moment. Either choice was professionally damaging. "Very well," David said, his jaw tightening with the determination I'd seen him use in hostile takeovers. "You want to play hardball? Let's play hardball. You think you can just waltz in here with your law degree and some forensic accounting and take half of everything I've built?" The mask was finally off. This was the David I'd suspected existed beneath the charming exterior. The man who viewed every relationship as a transaction, every interaction as a potential victory or defeat. "I didn't build anything, David. We built it. Together, with community property funds, with my unpaid labor, with my support and sacrifice. But you've been so busy trying to cut me out of the picture that you forgot I was there for all of it." "You were there, but you weren't building anything. You were shopping, having lunch with friends, playing at volunteer work. I was the one working 18-hour days, making the deals, taking the risks." The accusation stung because it contained just enough truth to be believable. I had lunched with friends and done volunteer work. What David had never bothered to notice was that those lunches were often with potential clients for his business, women whose husbands ran companies that could benefit from his services. The volunteer work had included pro bono legal services that had kept my skills sharp and my license active. But explaining that would validate his fundamental assumption that my worth was measured by my contribution to his success rather than my value as an individual. "You're right, David. I wasn't building your empire. I was building something else entirely, a case for when this day came. And based on the evidence I've compiled, I'd say I built it rather well." I opened my portfolio to a section David hadn't seen yet, documents that represented months of careful investigation and preparation. "Shall we discuss the Cayman Islands accounts in detail, or would you prefer to start with the property in Switzerland that you purchased under your mother's maiden name?" David's face went white. The Swiss property was his deepest secret, purchased 3 years ago as what he'd told his financial advisor was his nuclear option, a hidden asset that could never be traced back to him in divorce proceedings. Walsh was frantically taking notes, clearly hearing about these assets for the first time. "Mr. Matthews, when we discussed your financial situation, you didn't mention any foreign real estate holdings." "Because they're not relevant to the divorce," David said quickly. "Those are business investments, completely separate from marital assets." "Actually," I interjected, producing bank records that showed the source of funds for the Swiss purchase. "The down payment came from a loan against our Malibu house. The mortgage payments are being made from your business account, which receives its funding from our community property business. Under California law, that makes the Swiss property community property, regardless of whose name is on the deed." The documentation was meticulous, showing a clear paper trail from community property funds to the hidden asset. David had been so focused on hiding the property's existence that he'd failed to hide its funding source. "Furthermore," I continued, producing additional documents, "I have copies of your communications with your financial advisor discussing your plans to disappear assets before the wife gets any ideas about divorce. These emails are dated 18 months before you filed for divorce, proving premeditation in your asset concealment." Walsh was looking increasingly uncomfortable as he realized the extent of his client's deception. Not only had David lied to me about our financial situation, but he'd apparently been less than completely honest with his own attorney. David, Walsh said carefully, we need to have another private conversation. No, David's voice was sharp, final. I'm not hiding from this anymore. Ella, you want to know the truth? Fine, here's the truth. I planned this divorce for 3 years because I knew exactly what kind of woman you really are. The room went silent. Even Walsh seemed shocked by the venom in David's voice. You think you're so clever, hiding your law degree, playing the perfect housewife while secretly documenting everything I did? But I knew, Ella. I've known for years that you never really gave up law, that you were just waiting for your chance to use it against me. The confession was stunning, not just for its content, but for what it revealed about the dynamics of our marriage. David hadn't been fooled by my performance as the dutiful wife. He'd been conducting his own performance as the loving husband while preparing for war. If you knew I was still practicing law, why did you proceed with asset concealment? You must have realized I'd discover it eventually. Because I thought I was smarter than you, he said, the admission clearly painful. I thought my financial advisors were better than whatever pro bono resources you had access to. I thought Harrison here could intimidate you into accepting whatever we offered. Walsh winced at being included in David's miscalculations, but didn't interrupt. The conversation had moved beyond legal strategy into personal confession, and stopping it now might be more damaging than letting it continue. But mostly, David continued, his voice growing colder, I thought you'd never have the courage to fight me. 22 years of marriage, and you never once stood up to me. You agreed to everything, supported every decision, made every sacrifice I asked for. I thought you were weak. The words should have hurt, but instead they felt liberating. For years, I'd wondered if David's dismissive treatment was somehow my fault, if I'd failed to communicate my worth or assert my value. Now I understood that he'd seen my cooperation as weakness rather than love, my support as subservience rather than partnership. You're right, I said quietly. I never stood up to you. I thought that's what love looked like, supporting your dreams, facilitating your success, making myself smaller so you could be bigger. I thought I was being a good wife. You were being a doormat. The cruel assessment hung in the air. 22 years of marriage reduced to a single, devastating judgment. But instead of crushing me, it clarified everything. This wasn't about property division or financial settlements. This was about respect, recognition, and the fundamental question of what I was worth. You're absolutely right, David. I was a doormat. But even doormats have value, and under California law, that value is quantifiable. I turned to a fresh page in my portfolio, revealing calculations that represented weeks of meticulous work. Let's discuss the economic value of my contributions to our marriage. 22 years of unpaid domestic labor at market rates for housekeeping, cooking, social management, and personal assistance. 22 years of unpaid business support, including market research, client development, and administrative services. 22 years of opportunity cost for abandoning my legal career. Walsh was staring at the numbers, his expression growing increasingly grim as he realized the magnitude of what I was claiming. Based on conservative market rates and compound interest, the value of my unpaid contributions to our marriage totals approximately $2.3 million. This is separate from and in addition to my claim on community property assets. The number represented more than just money. It represented recognition of value that had been dismissed and ignored for decades. David had treated my contributions as worthless, but the law saw them differently. This is ridiculous, David sputtered. You can't bill me retroactively for being married to you. Actually, under California Family Code Section 4320, courts can consider the extent to which one spouse's career was impacted by unemployment or other circumstances directly related to the marriage. My abandonment of legal practice to support your career is a textbook example. Walsh was consulting his own legal resources now, frantically checking citations and precedents. Everything I was claiming was legally sound, based on established California family law precedents that he should have considered from the beginning. Even if we accept your valuations, he said carefully, your total claim would be approximately $50 million. That represents roughly 2/3 of my client's total assets. 67%, to be precise, I agreed, which, coincidentally, is almost exactly the percentage of his net worth that was built using community property funds and my unpaid labor. The mathematics were devastating and undeniable. David's empire hadn't been built in isolation. It had been constructed using marital resources and supported by decades of uncompensated work. Under community property law, I was entitled to recognition of that contribution. Furthermore, I continued, producing the final document from my portfolio, I'm prepared to file criminal charges for financial elder abuse, fraud, and perjury. David has systematically lied about our financial situation, hidden assets that belong to the community, and attempted to defraud me of my legal rights. The threat of criminal charges changed everything. Walsh understood that if prosecutors decided to pursue the case, David could face not just financial penalties, but potential imprisonment. The hidden assets, the lies to his attorney, the systematic deception, all of it could be construed as criminal behavior under California's aggressive financial abuse statutes. Mrs. Matthews, Walsh said, his voice carefully controlled, what would you require to forego criminal prosecution? The question was an admission of defeat. Walsh was no longer negotiating from a position of strength, but trying to minimize his client's losses. The tables had turned completely. Full financial disclosure of all assets, domestic and foreign. Immediate repatriation of all hidden funds. A property settlement that reflects the true value of community assets and my contributions. And a public apology acknowledging that I was never the helpless housewife you portrayed me as. The last demand was purely personal, but it was also strategic. David's business reputation was built on his image as a successful entrepreneur, but that image had always included the narrative of the supportive wife who'd sacrificed her career for his success. A public acknowledgement of my legal credentials would force him to confront the reality of who I actually was rather than who he'd wanted me to be. David sat in silence for several minutes, processing the magnitude of his situation. Everything he'd worked to protect was slipping away, not because of bad luck or circumstances beyond his control, but because he'd fundamentally underestimated the woman he'd shared his life with for over 2 decades. Ella, he said finally, his voice different than I'd ever heard it, smaller, uncertain, almost vulnerable. I never meant for it to get this ugly. Yes, you did. My response was matter of fact, without anger or accusation. You planned for it to get ugly. You spent 3 years hiding assets and building a case designed to leave me with nothing. The only thing you didn't plan for was me fighting back. I thought you'd just accept whatever I offered. Take the house, take the alimony, move on with your life. Move on to what, David? I gave up my career, my independence, my identity to be your wife. What exactly did you think I'd move on to? The question hung in the air, unanswered, because there was no good answer. David had never considered what would happen to me after the divorce because he'd never really considered me as an independent person with needs and goals beyond serving his interests. Walsh cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of a negotiation that had spiraled far beyond his experience. Perhaps we should take a break, let everyone consider their positions. No, I said firmly, we finish this today. I've spent 22 years waiting for David to see me as an equal partner. I'm not waiting any longer. I stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city where I'd once built a promising legal career before setting it aside for love. From this height, the sprawling metropolis looked manageable, organized, and comprehensible, unlike the mess my life had become. But for the first time in years, I felt like I could see a clear path forward. When I returned to the table, both men were watching me with new expressions. Walsh with professional respect, tinged with wariness. David with something that might have been recognition, though it had come far too late to save our marriage. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd spent decades suppressing. David will provide complete financial disclosure within 7 days. All hidden assets will be repatriated within 30 days. We'll divide community property assets 50-50, plus my claim for economic damages from unpaid contributions. The total you're demanding is unreasonable, Walsh protested, though his heart clearly wasn't in the fight anymore. The total I'm demanding is legally justified and mathematically precise, but I'm prepared to be reasonable about one thing. I'll accept payment over time to avoid forcing a fire sale of business assets. David can keep operational control of his company and pay me my share over 5 years, with appropriate interest and security provisions. The offer was generous, designed to preserve the business that had been built with community property while ensuring I received fair compensation for my contributions. It was the kind of solution that could have been reached months ago if David had approached the divorce with honesty instead of deception. David looked up, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time all afternoon. "You'd really accept a payment plan?" "Under certain conditions, full financial transparency going forward, an acknowledgement letter stating that our divorce was caused by your deception rather than any failure on my part, and immediate payment of my legal fees and costs." "How much in legal fees?" Walsh asked, though he clearly dreaded the answer. "Based on 80 hours at $650 per hour, plus expenses, approximately $60,000. The sum was substantial, but hardly unreasonable for a case of this complexity. Walsh had probably billed David more than that for far simpler matters. But seeing me claim compensation for my legal work forced him to confront the reality that he'd been facing a professional opponent from the very beginning. "David," I said, my voice softer now that the battle was essentially over, "this doesn't have to destroy you. Your business is strong, your reputation can survive, and you'll still be worth more than most people dream of. But it ends the fiction that I was just along for the ride." David nodded slowly, the fight finally going out of him. "I'll agree to your terms." Walsh looked like he wanted to advise against it, but he also understood that fighting further would likely result in worse terms for his client. The evidence was overwhelming, the legal precedents clear, and the potential for criminal prosecution real. "I'll need everything in writing," I said, producing a draft settlement agreement I'd prepared weeks ago. "I've taken the liberty of outlining the basic terms. Mr. Walsh can review it and suggest modifications, but the core provisions are non-negotiable." As Walsh began reading the settlement agreement, I felt a strange mixture of triumph and sadness. I'd won, but victory felt different than I'd expected. There was satisfaction in the vindication, relief in the financial security, but also grief for the marriage that could have been if David had seen me as a partner rather than a possession. "There's one more thing," I said, withdrawing a final document from my briefcase. "I'm returning to active legal practice. I've accepted a position with Morrison & Associates, my sister's firm. I wanted you both to know that if you encounter me in future cases, it won't be as the underestimated housewife." The announcement was both practical and symbolic. After 22 years of hiding my professional identity, I was reclaiming it fully. Eleanor had offered me a partnership position when I'd called her about the divorce, understanding that I needed not just legal support, but professional resurrection. David stared at me, perhaps seeing me clearly for the first time in decades. "You're really doing this. You're really starting over." "I'm not starting over, David. I'm continuing from where I left off, with 22 years of additional life experience and a very clear understanding of my own worth." 3 hours later, we'd signed a comprehensive settlement agreement that gave me everything I demanded and more. David would pay me $47 million over 5 years, plus immediate compensation for my unpaid contributions. He would retain control of his business, but under court supervision to ensure compliance with the payment schedule. More importantly, he would issue a public statement acknowledging that our divorce resulted from his financial deception rather than any failure on my part as a wife or partner. It was a small victory, but one that mattered to me personally. As we gathered our papers and prepared to leave, Walsh approached me with something resembling professional respect. "Miss Morrison, I have to say, this was masterfully handled. I've been practicing family law for 25 years, and I've rarely seen a case prepared with such thoroughness." "Thank you, Mr. Walsh. I hope you'll remember this the next time you assume an unrepresented party doesn't understand the law." He nodded, understanding the lesson I was teaching. Assumptions about people's capabilities, especially assumptions based on gender or perceived social status, were dangerous in legal proceedings. I'd used his preconceptions against him, allowing him to underestimate me until it was too late to recover. David and I left the building separately, 22 years of marriage officially ending in a Los Angeles law office on a Tuesday afternoon. As I walked to my car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: complete freedom to be whoever I chose to be. 6 months later, I was settling into my new office at Morrison & Associates, preparing for a case involving another desperate housewife whose husband had assumed she'd accept whatever settlement he offered. Eleanor had built the firm's reputation on taking cases that other attorneys considered unwinnable: women who'd been dismissed, underestimated, or simply ignored by their husbands and the legal system. My first client was remarkably similar to the woman I'd pretended to be for 2 decades. Sarah Walker had been married to a tech entrepreneur for 15 years, supporting his career while raising their children and managing their social obligations. When he filed for divorce, he offered her a settlement that amounted to roughly 5% of their community assets, assuming she'd be grateful for whatever she could get. "Mrs. Walker," I said, reviewing her case file, "tell me about your husband's assumptions about your capabilities." She smiled ruefully. "He thinks I don't understand money or business. He handles all our finances, makes all the major decisions. He keeps telling me I should be realistic about what I deserve." "And what do you think you deserve?" "Half of everything we built together, but I don't know how to prove it." I leaned back in my chair, remembering the woman I'd been just months earlier. "Mrs. Walker, let me tell you something important. Being underestimated can be the most powerful weapon you have. The key is knowing how to use it." Over the next hour, I outlined a strategy that would use her husband's assumptions against him, much as I'd done with David. We would document every hidden asset, trace every questionable transaction, and build a case that would shatter his preconceptions about the woman he'd dismissed. As Sarah left my office, energized and hopeful for the first time in months, I felt the satisfaction that came from using my skills to level playing fields that had been tilted by assumption and prejudice. My phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. "Client meeting went well?" "Very well," I replied. "I think I'm going to like being back in practice." "Good, because I have 3 more cases just like it. Apparently, word is getting around about the lawyer who destroyed Harrison Walsh's reputation." I smiled, thinking about the journey that had brought me from David's conference room to this moment. I'd spent 22 years being the person someone else wanted me to be. Now I had the rest of my life to be exactly who I was meant to be, a woman who refused to be underestimated ever again. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's becoming so successful that your former opponent realizes exactly what they lost when they decided you weren't worth their respect. David learned that lesson the hard way, but for me, it wasn't about revenge at all. It was about reclaiming an identity I'd set aside for love and discovering that it had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The Harvard Law degree had been gathering dust in a filing cabinet for over 20 years. But justice, like truth, has a way of surfacing when you least expect it and most need it. I never did thank David for underestimating me, but in a way, his dismissal had been the greatest gift he could have given me, the motivation to remember exactly who I was beneath the facade I'd constructed to please him. And now, finally, I was free to be that person again.